It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, What's the Connection? Sleep and the Epilepsy Spectrum. My name is Eileen Penn-Miller, and I'm the parent of a son with a rare epilepsy and a fierce advocate for all people living with the epilepsies. We planned this event during the month of March because we'll be celebrating in just a few weeks National Sleep Awareness Week. The importance of sleep is drilled into us from a very early age. It's an essential function to help your body and your mind recharge. Get enough sleep and you feel on top of the world, alert and refreshed. Sleep deprivation, short or long term, can impact our ability to concentrate, to think. It impacts our memory, our mood, and even our stress. It can compromise our growth, our health, and our wellness. Introduce epilepsy into the sleep equation, and the interaction makes it very, very complicated. For some people, like my son, a lack of sleep can trigger seizures. Others may experience seizures during the night and their sleep is compromised. For others, you may have nocturnal epilepsy diagnosis, a specific seizure disorder where seizures occur while you're sleeping. And frankly, so many other variations of these. We have a lot of ground to cover today as we look across the spectrum of epilepsy, diagnoses from those controlled through those living with the rare or refractory epilepsies. And I am so excited to be joined by three extraordinary panelists. Desiree Ann Ramsaran, who goes by Des, is an adult and a medical student diagnosed with juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, JME. She also recently just celebrated a birthday, so let's all wish Des a happy birthday. We are also joined by clinician Dr. Jesus Pina Garza, who is the director of Pediatric Epilepsy Program at Centennial Children's Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. And I want to give a shout out to all our friends, both in Tennessee and around the country, because Epilepsy Foundation is going to be coming there later this spring with our very first Epicon. We'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And also I'd like to welcome Angie Aldridge, who is a caregiver for a son with SCN2A, a rare epilepsy. She was recommended to us by our friends at Families SCN2A. Angie also has a podcast called Embracing Holland and a blog post. I'm a huge fan of both. And then finally, I would just like to thank our sponsors, Neurocrine Biosciences and UCB. So without further delay, we're going to get started, and I'm going to actually kick this off with our two family members, with Angie and with Des, to tell us a little bit about their journey in regards to sleep and epilepsy. And Angie, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. I am the mom of three amazing kiddos. My middle child, Mark, is 8 years old, and he has a rare epilepsy as SCN2A, also causes autism, GI dysfunction, and a whole host of other things. SCN2A affects pretty much his whole body. So we have been navigating the world of rare disease for the past 7 years. And by daytime, I work in higher education. I've been in advising for almost 20 years. And as Eileen mentioned, I host a podcast called Embracing Holland, where we interview families who have disabilities. And I chronicle our journey throughout this whole process on my blog, Mighty and the Bean, on angiealdridge.com. So that's my therapeutic outlet to kind of walk through everything that we do. My journey with epilepsy with our son started really, he got the SCN2A diagnosis when he was 2. And we were told that epilepsy was a possibility for him. And so we always were on the lookout for seizures. And it wasn't until the past 6 months that we determined that he has a rare form of epilepsy, ESES, which causes abnormal spike wave activity at night. So I know we're going to talk a little bit more about how we knew what to look for, but that is our connection to epilepsy and sleep.
Thank you so much for being here, Angie, and for sharing your story and your journey. And we are looking forward to learning more. Desiree, and I know you like to go by Des, will you tell us a little bit about your epilepsy and connections to sleep?
Hi, everyone. I'm Des. I'm from Trinidad, and I moved to the US to study medicine. Thanks to the EFA for reaching out so I could participate in this. So my epilepsy story, I was diagnosed with JME at 12 years old. And at that point, I wanted to be a pilot. But obviously, someone with seizure disorder, it's kind of difficult to become a pilot. So at that point, I kind of transitioned to I want to help others because, as we know, in general, like a lot of neuro disorders, there's not a lot of knowledge, and there's not a lot of research. Well, there is a lot of research, but not much has been found. There's a lot of question marks in this field, so I figured I'd get into it. But that being said, sleep for me has been a big deal. At that point in time, my doctor said I need to get 9 to 10 hours of sleep, which at that point, at 12 years old, was fine. Like, hey, I got to sleep more. But as I got older and I got into medical school, that became a bit of a challenge. And for me, it really came down to time management and having to figure out how to balance my sleep with my work and somehow fit some social aspect into there. Um, so yeah, that's really been my biggest thing. Um, and I would like to go into pediatric neurology to help other kids who may have been diagnosed with seizure disorders like me.
Yes, applauds for you. We're so happy that your personal experiences has inspired you to pursue this and to add your experience and your knowledge to the field. And thank you also for sharing. I'm going to actually turn to Dr. Pina Garza as our resident sleep and epilepsy expert to just talk us through a little bit of the bidirectional relationship between sleep and epilepsy.
Hi, Eileen. Hi, everybody. And I guess you introduced me as a sleep expert. And yes, I sleep every night, so I know a little bit about that. So there is a lot of connections between sleep and epilepsy. And one thing that is like sometimes sleep can be a trigger, but it's an essential need. So for any illness, as you mentioned earlier, for just the well-being of a person, you have to have a good sleep, a good regular sleep. By the way, you know, we all secrete melatonin when it gets dark. So the only person that really needs for sure is a blind person. But for other people, it helps us to regulate when to fall asleep. For many of us, it's just listening to our body and trying to sleep as much as we need to feel refreshed. But that's a very important thing. And we have, you know, a lot of conditions that when we have a sleep, couple of things that happen that are different from the wake state is that there is a hypersynchrony of the brain. So the brain goes into a resting mode, and some of the circuitries have these cycles that occur on both sides of the brain. When we're awake, it looks like every part of the brain is doing something different. But that hypersynchrony is also one of the essential things for seizures to become visible. So there are two things for seizures to occur. One is hyperexcitability, and the other one is hypersynchrony. And hypersynchrony happens during sleep. So as Angie mentioned earlier, there are conditions like electrical status epilepticus of sleep, where actually, you know, you may not have a lot of visible seizures, but your brain, when you're sleeping, it looks like if you're in a continuous seizure. Therefore, we hypothesize that that affects a lot of your daytime function. We have conditions like Landau-Kleffner, where kids can have like an abrupt onset of this continuous electrical discharge. And when first diagnosed, these kids were in institutions for the deaf because they were not responding, but actually they were not deaf. They were autistic from this tremendous amount of abnormal activity during sleep. The thing that is not easy is like we have conditions like Rolandic epilepsy, one of the most common conditions where you can have an EEG that looks just as bad, but then the person is doing great at the school and seizure free. So we don't know, like Desiree mentioned earlier, we don't know all the answers, but we know sleep is a factor. And there's a lot of comments. I'll touch on that as you give me opportunity, because I want to share the mic with everybody.
Dr. Pina Garza, can you tell us a little bit about, maybe the difference for somebody who is well controlled and maybe the, lack of sleep is a trigger for their epilepsy, different from somebody who has a nighttime diagnosis of epilepsy?
So there are some conditions like the, Rolandic epilepsy, maybe one of those, autosomal dominant frontal lobe epilepsy, maybe another one, where seizures tend to occur at night. And for that, we still recommend you to sleep well and sleep long, whatever you need. But sometimes that may help us to put our treatment with the higher levels of anti-seizure medication during those times to see if we can get that under control. Now, sleep deprivation, huge, especially for things like juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, to the point that one of my most senior doctors in Taiwan, I was invited to lecture there, and he told me, he says, I don't put anybody on medications. I first tell them to sleep well. And if they have seizures, then I start medications. And with all respect, I said, a lot of them are still going to have seizures, so I prefer them to sleep well. But you never know when you have to sleep deprived. Desiree is a medical student, and if you were my resident, I would try to accommodate that as much as possible. But sometimes just your profession is going to keep you up. And we have to have like a treatment that allows you to have sometimes that possibility when needed. So, but it's very important to sleep.
So I want to start to begin to integrate some of the questions in from our audience. And Christina asked that she's been told that most seizures happen either as you fall asleep and or wake up. And she's curious if that's true and why that is. And Dr. Pina Garza, I'll direct that question to you.
Yes, there's a lot of seizures. One of the things that we see, I was talking about synchrony. And from the time you go into drowsiness, we start seeing this abundance of hypersynchrony. So there are some patients that's the time, the first couple of hours after going to sleep. But we have a lot of patients that just have it in the middle of the night, whether it's a temporal lobe epilepsy, a frontal lobe epilepsy, and others. And then again, we have the patients that have seizures upon awakening. So you have to really look at your condition. Everybody, even though in epilepsy, we have these kind of baskets that we try to put a lot of patients in the same basket. There's some commonality, but every person is different. Everybody's an individual. And when Angie's talking about ESES, my antennas go up like SEN2A, which everybody learns about SEN with Dravet and say, don't use sodium channels. But guess what? SEN2A many times responds to sodium channels. And if you have an ESES, I'm not trying to do a consultation here, but the new genetics allow you sometimes to look at the more individual treatment. You're going to be down the road with pharmacogenomics in situations where we're going to say, you have epilepsy, and we're not going to say you have a partial seizures or you have generalized seizures. We're going to say you have this genetic mutation, and this is the medication you should take. It's going to happen. It's happening now, but it's going to be more and more prevalent.
You are responding to one of my favorite topics, which is, and I'll just plant the seed, if you don't know the specific cause of your epilepsy, make every effort that you can to figure it out, because it may both impact your treatment as well as help you sort of understand what's coming down the pike. And actually, I think that's a good segue. Angie, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience of your son being diagnosed. You had your epilepsy, or you had your SCN2A diagnosis fairly early on, but how did you discover that your son was having the nighttime seizures? Can you characterize that for us a little bit more?
Yeah, the interesting thing about our story is that we had no clue that anything was amiss at nighttime. It was all during the day. So just like everybody else, last year we were pandemic parenting. We were working from home. We had our 3 kids trying to do Zoom with it like everybody else. And our son, Mark, began unraveling as a person. That's the best way I could explain it. His behaviors became, he never used to have behaviors. When I talk about he was just, demonstrating aggression. He was trying to attack his service dog. These were all behaviors that he had never had prior to this. Was very uncharacteristic of him. And he began to also have learning regression to the point where toileting became pretty much impossible. He had lost the ability to, go and stay dry during the day. I mean, these were all skills that he had previously mastered. So we began also to see he was very resistant to even doing any online learning. So at first we thought, oh, this is just the pandemic. This is him not being in his routine, not going to school. We just kept blaming it on that. And as the months went on, things just kept getting worse. He would have meltdowns. He couldn't handle things, little disruptions and to his routine that used to be kind of an annoyance became a trigger for a very big meltdown. And so we knew that his behavior was communicating something to us. We just weren't sure what. So I sent all the messages in all the portals to all the doctors saying, this is what we're seeing. I don't know what's going on. Our biggest diagnosis at that point was autism. I knew that SCN2A was the cause of autism, of his autism. And I knew that it was a clue that there may be epilepsy, but I didn't put it all together that that was what was going on. And so we had an appointment with his neurologist, and my good buddy Leah with the Families SCN2A Foundation said, tell the neurologist 3 things. She said, learning regression, behavioral problems, and nighttime waking. And that should do it to be able to make sure that we could do an EEG. Because I had said before in years past, should we be doing an EEG regularly just to check? He's predisposed to seizures. Should we be checking? Because the last time he had an EEG was when he was 2 years old. So it had been 6 years. So we did the EEG. And sure enough, it came back that he was having abnormal spike waves 86% of the time while he was sleeping. So it was a very clear ESES diagnosis. And so then that landed us in a week at Johns Hopkins at their epilepsy monitoring unit. And from there, they confirmed the diagnosis. They were showing the high incidence of abnormal spike wave activity. And while we were there, they did a trial of high dose Valium. And he responded that the next day they came in and all the residents were very excited because his spike waves went to 0. So that he responded very well. We did not think that he would respond as well as he did. They did a half dose the next night, and he's been on Valium ever since. And as a result of finding that out and getting it treated, Mark now has regained all of his lost skills. He's now sleeping through the night. He was night waking, but that wasn't our biggest clue. He had always had terrible sleep from infancy, and people just chalk it up to, oh, that's autism, and so it was like, he had trouble going to sleep. He'd wake up at 2 a.m. and we'd start our day. And that was just sort of like, that's supposed to be our normal. And so I didn't take that to mean that that meant something significant in terms of his diagnosis. So it's now controlled, and he is doing really well, gained back everything. The meltdowns within 3 days of being treated and having actual sleep, he has no more meltdowns. So it's truly like, we were very blessed. We realized we were very lucky. I know a lot of other families who trial medication after medication and have a trouble controlling, but that's thankfully our situation turned out the way it did.
Thank you so much for sharing that that story, because I think your journey may resonate with a lot of folks in the audience that have made a discovery based upon experiences by day that led them to sort of hypothesize, is there something that's happening during other parts of the day that could be contributing to this? And I think, and perhaps if not, perhaps that's planting a seed for people that if you are seeing a change in you or your loved ones, behaviors, wakefulness, that maybe that could be an insight that there's something else going on. There's so many things that you touched on in your response, Angie, that I want to follow up on. I do want to ask Dr. Pina Garza about the EEG, and I think we'll go there next. And then Desiree, I'm going to come back to you because I want to talk a little bit about your experience with sleep growing up and as an adult juggling medical school. But before we do, Dr. Pina Garza, can you talk about the importance of the EEG? And that was really instrumental in Angie's son diagnosis, what is an EEG? How is it used as part of the diagnostic tool, and in regards to sleep and epilepsy?
So if you look at the EEG, in some ways it's not different from an EKG, like a cardiac rhythm, because everybody's familiar. Every health show that we have on TV has always an EKG going on. So when you look at the EKG, you have a little spike, and that's what we see in epilepsy. But the spike is normal in the heart because all the heart cells discharge electrically at once and produce that electricity that can be captured, the summation of everything on the surface of the chest. Now, when you look at the EEG in the brain, electroencephalogram, every little part of the brain is doing something different. Some of the brain is trying to see, some of the brain is trying to hear, some of them is keeping you in posture. So every circuitry develops something different. When you have a spike, it means that a large volume, about 1.5 inch diameter of neurons discharge together. And that's abnormal. The brain has to have little signals to communicate. You don't have like all the cells going like 1, 2, 3, boom, like the heart. So that's what we see. And usually spikes are not part of the normal pattern. So the EEG is not necessarily the diagnosis of epilepsy. The diagnosis is based on a good history. There are some people that can have an abnormal EEG, like someone with tendency to have Rolandic epilepsy, and never have a seizure. So sometimes they come for a spell, they start the seizure. So it's not a good idea to just rely on one thing, but together it's very important. And the EEG during a sleep, it's essential because that's, again, when you're more likely to see the abnormality. In some cases, the diagnosis is only seen during a sleep. But even for people that have epilepsy, like focal epilepsy, you may see 2 or 3 spikes during 10 hours of wake EEG, and then during an hour of recording of sleep, you may see 100. So you may have a normal EEG for an hour during the wake state, and then if you record actually the sleep, you can have a diagnosis. So it's a very important tool. And then we have the monitoring, like when you go and try to capture a longer period of time, or perhaps even a spell, or try to see if people are having any spells that are so subtle that we don't know that they're happening, or for kids that have autism, for example, is essential, or some tendency to epilepsy, to look at that to be sure that you don't have ESES or Landau-Kleffman.
Just as a follow-up, can you differentiate, and this is one of the questions from our guests, between a EEG and a sleep study? Can you tell us the difference between sort of those two interventions?
So the sleep study is a study that is mostly trying to look at your sleep physiology. And as part of that, they use few recordings on the brain that look at the EEG. Because when we look at the EEG, just without looking at the person, we can tell you you're awake, you're drowsy, you're in a stage 2 sleep, you're now in deep sleep with rapid eye movement. So just looking at that, you can see it. In addition to that, they have a lot of monitorings for oxygenation and sleep patterns, because those are the things that mainly they try to detect people that have a sleep apnea. But obviously, if there's an abnormality in the EEG, sometimes the sleep doctor feels that maybe we should treat that first to see if we correct the other problem with the sleep apnea. On the reverse, correcting the sleep apnea for people that have both improves the epilepsy care. So there's, again, a bi-directional connection there.
I'm just looking at our questions. I'm going to just have a couple more follow-ups on the EEG questions. So folks are asking things like, how often should they have an EEG? Like, what would be the indication that it's time? And with what regularity do you recommend having an EEG?
You know, there has to be a reason. So the EEG, doing it more doesn't mean you're receiving better care. You may just reimburse the doctor a little bit better by doing that. But so there's no reason to do it just to do it. But in some cases, you need it initially to have a diagnosis. If you have a diagnosis and you get the treatment and you're completely controlled, there's nothing that you're seeing that is abnormal, behavioral, seizures, cognition, etc., you may need to repeat some EEG later in life to see if you can stop the treatment, because we have a lot of conditions that are outgrown and the EEG becomes normal and then you can stop treatment. Most of the time we start repeating that 2 years down the road. In conditions like JME, is very rarely to outgrow JME. So you do a repeat EEG, like I always have when I have people that have conditions that have absent seizures. Before they go to drive, I don't rely just on people telling me she's not staring. I want to do a 24-hour test to be sure that when you get to drive, you don't have a stare that can kill you or kill someone else. So that's a very important safety thing. So for people that have a developmental problem or a tendency to have seizures, we have a lot of kids that are born with cortical dysplasia or like Angie's son, that there's a tendency to have it. And there, I think you have to keep a surveillance. I'm not sure how often, but definitely if there's a change clinically, that's the time to do it. If there is no change, still I would probably repeat one every couple of years to be sure that there's not a change. Once you accomplish full maturity, perhaps you don't need to do it. But the brain is changing a lot in a little one, and things like that sometimes appear.
Thank you so much. That was very thorough, and I'm hoping that we covered several of the questions, and I see them coming in. We're going to get to more of those. But before we do, I want to switch gears just for a minute. And Des, I want to come back to you. You shared some personal stories about growing up with the JME diagnosis and what that was like for you, and also some of what it has meant to be a medical student, which, as Dr. Pina Garza shared, very demanding, oftentimes sleep depriving. Can you just tell us a little bit about, your experience growing up with an epilepsy diagnosis in relationship to sleep?
So for me, JME is something that like a big trigger is lack of sleep. But also JME, from what I've read on my own, is commonly associated with anxiety disorders. And of course, I have both, being in medical school, constantly stressed out. And as a result, sleep is actually quite difficult for me. It's something that I've struggled with for quite a long time. And a lot of what I do now is try to do things to get myself tired. And I know we get to this later on, but something in general, as someone growing up with epilepsy, I had to change a lot of things that people would do, like other kids. Like I couldn't go to sleepovers with my friends because if something happened, my parents would be worried. My friends wouldn't know what to do. I couldn't have caffeine. So no Coca-Cola, no coffee, no tea. I actually had to sleep in my parents' room till I was 17 because they were concerned, something happened. For me, I typically get myoclonic attacks, like when I wake up. My last grand mal seizure was 2016. And even something like that, I would have to shower with the bathroom door unlocked because I've had times where I've had a tonic-clonic seizure and fell in the shower. So it was a lot of social aspects that came into play besides the diagnosis itself. And with something like the absent seizures, which I would get, it became a thing of Des is faking. She's not actually sick. She looks fine. And it's hard to explain to a bunch of 15-year-olds, hey, no, she has something. So that was something that took some time to get adjusted to. And then just safety protocols. I would always use plastic dishes in the morning because I actually broke a lot of cups from dropping it. My cup of tea, I would just have a myoclonic attack and that'd be the end of my tea and my favorite mug. So I had to switch to plastic dishes in the morning, and I really had to come up with a routine to keep myself safe. And in doing so, I have accommodated my lifestyle to suit being a medical student. And that does require having to be upfront and tell my attending or whoever I'm working with, like, hey, this is the situation. I won't be able to do night shifts because that is something that will throw off my sleep cycle, and then I could get an attack. And I really would not like that because I'd be a danger, like the doctor said, not only to myself, but to others. And I have been medically cleared to drive, so I would like to keep that. So to do that, I need to make sure and keep my safe bubble, I like to call it, as clear as possible.
Thank you so much for your candor. I really appreciate, I know some of the things that you're talking about are hard. And I'm sure it was hard when you were growing up, as you were saying, to explain what your personal experience was to friends. But I'm sure for other people on this webinar, just listening and hearing, it's really helpful. And I think other folks will appreciate just your candor in describing that. I'm going to go back to some of the questions, and Jantel Price has a 13-month-old daughter who was diagnosed with Duze, and she was describing how she has ever since been experiencing insomnia. She's on a bunch of drugs and also takes melatonin at night, but she's very wakeful. And we haven't really talked about, we talked about the bidirectionality of epilepsy and sleep, but what we haven't talked about yet is the impact of some medications can also impact on your sleep. And so I wonder, Dr. Pina Garza, if you have any thoughts for this parent and her daughter.
Well, there's, in epilepsy, we're probably in the first wave of trying to find perfect matches between diagnosis and therapies. And for example, in Duze syndrome, or one thing we know is like what not to use, which is all the sodium channel drugs. Then we know there's a group of medications that are available now that are not sodium channel that provide good success. And what may be changing when you look at Duze syndrome from the past and Duze syndrome now is that many times you're going to have this diagnosis made before you start having bad seizures. For everybody in the audience, there's, like, in the United States, in Canada, and I think in Australia, there are programs that provide you free genetic testing for epilepsy under age 8 years. So everybody should get one. It's more work to actually read it and explain it, because many times it's not like super easy, but it's our duty to do that for every kid that has epilepsy. And fortunately, for people that are 8 years and older, it's definitely affordable, and it can give you the answer. It used to be a test that cost $10,000 and $1,000, and now you can get it probably for $200 if you have to pay out of pocket. But it's way less expensive than an MRI, and it's definitely, if it's going to help you, that's important. So that tells you we have medications to treat your epilepsy, but about 40 to 60%, perhaps even more, when you have difficult to control epilepsies, you have comorbidities. You have anxiety, you have depression, you have insomnia, and all of them, when treated, it makes your epilepsy better. And yes, sometimes we have to use 3, 4 medications. And for a young family, young parents, it's very hard to think like, I'm going to put my kid on 4 medications. But if you think about the complexity of the brain, I wish I had a medication that would work for everything. When you hear that from any therapy that is natural, it's not. It's very hard to find something that works for everything. So when someone tells you high oxygen works for everything, it's not true. There are some things that help little things, and sometimes it's worth to find a safe cocktail of things that can help your seizures, your anxiety, and your sleep to provide you with the best quality of life. So there's a ton of medications that we use as sleep aids. And you can move through that list from the safest to the strongest to try to find something for this baby. And it's not too early. So there's not a single symptom that you say, this person is too young to try medication, because they're too young to have insomnia. They're too young to have constipation. They're too young to suffer. So our job is to find something safe that makes that go away.
Yeah. So I think that's actually a good segue. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of treatments and interventions. And again, we are covering a lot of territory here. We're covering, people that have well-controlled epilepsy, through to people that are having, nighttime seizures, as well as nighttime syndromes that cause seizures. So I appreciate everybody's grace as we, try to cover a very broad and complicated topic. I want to talk, I want Angie and Desiree, and then last but not least, Dr. Pina Garza, just to talk a little bit about interventions. And I think depending upon your diagnosis, as Dr. Pina Garza was just suggesting, the interventions can be very variable. So Angie, you alluded earlier that there was medication that has, it sounds like, and knock on wood, really corrected your son's sleeping situation. Des, you shared with me some tips and tricks that you had, and then I want to hear from Dr. Pina Garza generally, like what are some interventions in the field for people? We'll start with you, Angie.
So we, as I mentioned, have gotten him on Valium, which was very effective. But the plan long-term is not for him to remain on Valium. I believe that likely he'll be weaned, and I don't know if that means an anti-epileptic drug is in our future. But as it was mentioned earlier, it's really important to know your epilepsy cause, because it really does help to inform potentially what could be useful. With SCN2A specifically, there's loss of function mutations and gain of function mutations. And depending on which side you fall will actually inform which AED they might try that would, has proven to be successful based on how the channel functions. So we, armed with that information, if we have to move on to an AED in the future, that's going to be really important that we have that as part of the conversation.
I feel like if it's anyone to talk about sleep, it's a medical student. So, yeah, like I said, I do have problems sleeping. So a lot of what I do is keep the same sleep cycle, even on weekends. I wake up at 7:30 a.m. every single day. Doesn't matter if I have to go in for 10 a.m. or if it's the weekend and I'm off. It kind of helps that I have 2 parakeets and they are very needy. So they wake me up 7:30 on the dot every day. But to fall asleep at night, I use melatonin quite frequently. I have to see a sleep doctor to figure out what's going on. And I do mindfulness meditation. There's like this great podcast on Spotify that I listen to that helps with just really feeling in the moment. So mindfulness meditation, basically, for those who don't know what it is, it's essentially you're focusing on what is in the present. And a lot of times people's mind wander, and that's totally normal. But you might be tired and you don't realize because your mind is somewhere else. So for me, doing mindfulness, I really get to focus in on what I currently feel. And a lot of the times I am tired. It's just that I'm so worked up over something with school or something else going on that I don't realize. So I do that. I also cut off screen time pretty early, and I read before bed. And like no caffeine. I try to avoid taking naps. And one of the things I actually learned to do, which is kind of funny, if I really can't sleep sometimes, I will just put on like one of those boring lectures that I didn't like and let that run in the background, and I will drift right to sleep. So that helps.
Hopefully your professors are not watching this podcast, this webinar.
I hope not.
Dr. Pita Garza, do you want to maybe just break down for us? And we do have quite a few questions about this in the questions as well. Just, interventions for sleep, to help with sleep, whether we're talking about, having seizures during sleep, or just trouble sleeping, as a comorbidity of having epilepsy.
So, a lot of times the medications that we use are very tightly connected regarding efficacy with the level of the medication in your blood. And that's why sometimes doctors measure that. So sometimes if there's a particular time where seizures occur, you want to have your higher levels of medication around that time. In this case, it would be something like if you have seizures during the first hour of sleep, you don't want to take the medication right before sleep. You want to take it perhaps 1.5 hours before, so that you can protect that to the maximum. So it's just very simple common sense, but common sense is rare. So you have to really actually ask the question, when would be the best time of my dosing to help the time of my seizures? So clearly, if you have seizures upon arousal, the best you can do is as late as possible before you go to sleep, so that you wake up with good levels. Then it's very important to try to regulate the sleep. And, fortunately, in about anywhere between 60 to 80% of people that suffer epilepsy, depending on the syndrome, you're able to provide them with seizure freedom as long as you give them an option that is easy to adhere to. And that would be like once a day, because when you take once a day, people missed about 10% of the doses, twice a day, 20%, 3 times a day, 37. So you have to match them with something that is doable and give them a system that gives them reminders. If you ask anybody that doesn't have a system how often you miss it, they will tell you never, because it's hard to report something you forgot, right? So you don't know it happened. But you have to come up with all these things. And the most important is that people with epilepsy are not just seizures. So I love the opportunity when people have epilepsy, we spent a lot of the time that we have in the visit trying to develop a strategy to stop the seizures, because that's the most dramatic, the most serious, the most potentially fatal symptom. So we put a lot of focus on that. But I love when we finally get control and then we go like, hey, how are you sleeping? How's your mood? How's your quality of life? And then you can spend a lot of time on making other things that help not only the patient. If you have someone with insomnia in the family, nobody sleeps. So everybody's tired, especially if it's a kid. If it's an adult, that's different. But if it's a kid, if the kid doesn't sleep, every parent's going to be sleep deprived. They're going to be prone to have accidents because they're fatigued. So and then the mood. About anywhere between 20 to 60% of people with epilepsy can experience some low mood. And it's not because you have epilepsy. Your epilepsy can be completely controlled. It's just a comorbidity. But if you don't ask the question, people that have low depression, they won't tell you. Even people that are suicidal, they don't share that with you unless you ask it. And it's a huge, huge difference, because you can improve the quality of life. So again, when we treat epilepsy, seizure is the obvious, but we have to look at all the different symptoms and parts of the human being to make it better.
I really appreciate you bringing up the comorbidities, and also we could probably do a whole separate session about the caregiver and sleep. I was thinking about that earlier. We're really not even talking about, the toll that the lack of sleep, if you're caring for somebody with a severe or a nighttime seizure, what impact that has on you and your ability to function by day and go about your business. So I definitely want to acknowledge Angie and Dez's parents and all the other caregivers out there that have I'm sure, gone to great strides to keep loved ones safe and endured their own sleep complications resultingly. I am keeping an eye on the time, and we've only got about 10 minutes left. And I want to make sure that we talk about safety and sleep. I think it's incredibly important. Dr. Pina Garza, I wanted to start with you about who should be monitored during their sleep. And then Angie and Desiree, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in if you're aware. I know Desiree, you mentioned sleeping in the same room as your parents for safety, and just curious about what are some of the strategies that you both have used within your families to ensure safe sleep. So Dr. Pina Garza, we'll start with you. Is there a profile of a person that should have nighttime monitoring?
So I think that anybody that doesn't have epilepsy control benefit from some monitoring. And there's different circumstances, but for the kids, it's not particularly any specific device. It's just a baby monitor. It's having like something that alerts you there's noise or changes in that room. That's probably one of the best monitors. The technology has evolved that, for example, people that live independently can have a watch that detects a seizure. And at least it can alert someone else close by to come and provide assistance. So let's say a college student that may have a roommate that their phones get the signal, or the parents at home may get that and they can call the person responsible for the building to come to provide assistance. So there's a lot of different things like that. For everybody, it's good to have like some general things, like having firm surfaces rather than very soft things where you could suffocate if you have a seizure. So just like little general things about how to make your sleep safer, because even if you're seizure free, that's potentially always a situation that can occur. But definitely when once you're controlled, we feel that driving is possible. So that tells you that almost anything is possible. But there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of safety. And even for people that are controlled and are able to drive, I always tell them, you know what? There's still a little bit of this rare sense, common sense, that should tell you what to do. You're controlled, you can drive, but guess what? If you're really sleep deprived and with fever that morning, why don't you let someone else drive that day? You're not going to lose your license, but just have some caution. For people that have epilepsy that is focal, that they have like a little warning, why don't you drive in the lane close to the shoulder? So if you feel anything happening, you move there and try to brake, as compared to being in the fastest lane. So there's little things that you can do always to try to keep yourself safer.
Angie, would you like to weigh in also with some of the ways that you've helped keep your son Mark safe?
Yeah, so we use a baby monitor, which I think has been mentioned multiple times in the chat. We've always used a baby monitor. We also have him sleeping in a medical bed, a sleep safe bed that has the high sides that's open on the top. We have done that prior to his epilepsy diagnosis just for wandering and general safety at nighttime, but it allows us to have him safely contained, and we have a monitor. Also, during the process of going through figuring out that he had epilepsy and that figuring out treatment, we did a sleep study. That was something that was recommended, a polysomnogram, and we wanted to check his breathing because we had heard him loudly snoring several different times. So we wanted to check for apnea, and it came back that for him it was normal, but it at least gave me some peace of mind that they checked his respiration and his cardiac activity at nighttime, and all of that came back within normal range. So in addition to the sleep safe bed, the baby monitor, that study helped. I know it was just one snapshot, but at least it gave us some data to say that at nighttime he wouldn't necessarily have to wear any devices that would need to monitor him.
Great, thank you. And Des, what about you? I know you mentioned earlier some of the precautions that you took when you were younger in your parents' household. Now that you're living independently, are there other precautions that you take?
Yeah, so actually, talking about the whole dorm situation, I couldn't have a roommate because I feel like it's unfair to ask someone else to keep the lights dim by a certain time and don't make too much noise coming into the room if you're out studying late and don't be loud. Like personally, I just felt like it was too much to ask of someone, so I got a private room as my dorm. Um, but that being said, I had to let someone know in case anything happened, like to check on me. So I let my flatmates know, hey, this is the situation. I was lucky that we were all in medicine, so they were okay with checking on me. I would leave my door unlocked to sleep, and I told them if I'm not up by like 9, just come and check on me. But I am very well controlled now, so that's why I'm able to do that. Even then, I generally keep my bed jammed to a wall, and I have like really soft memory foam mats on the side of the bed. So if something were to happen and I were to fall off, at least I'm on something cushioned. Um, and then a big thing for me, safety wise, is I make sure I take my medications. Like I take it when I eat, like or first thing when I wake up. I do not forget to take my medications because like I said earlier, I want to maintain my ability to drive, but also I just don't like the hangover effect after a seizure is arguably worse for some people than the actual attack. Um, and then coming back to what Dr. Garza said, so when I don't feel well, I don't drive. If I wake up and I have an aura, so for me, my aura is like I kind of get like this uptight feeling like something bad is gonna happen. Sometimes I do get like the generic smelling something burning aura. So if I feel that, I will take an Ativan and go back to bed and recover. And I won't drive. I will let someone know, hey, this is going on. I do use the sleep app on my phone sometimes to see if I'm snoring because obviously I'm not sleeping well. That's going to be another risk factor for me to get an attack. Um, yeah, and then like in terms of living, I always find apartment complexes that are really quiet. So I tend to go for smaller complexes so I don't have a lot of neighbors. Or if I do have neighbors, I tend to go for like a building with older people because they usually go to bed early. So it just maintains a peace and quiet. And I have like dimmer switches in my place. So when I wake up, if I need to go and use a bathroom at night, I just have these little dimmer switches instead of like the sudden bright lights. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
I love all three of you are sharing such not just your own personal stories, but really practical and actionable advice, which I think will be really appreciated by our guests today. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to just ask each of you to share with us just something that you would like folks to know, a final thought that you would like to share. So Angie, final thoughts on sleep and epilepsy.
Yeah, and this may not be the best audience to share this because everyone's interested in sleep and epilepsy, but for the general, population, when you're dealing with behaviors during the day, my best advice is to ask for an EEG to see if something is going on at nighttime. I had no idea that he was having such poor sleep. And it made total sense. If you or I were having abnormal activity 86% of the time we were sleeping, of course it would translate into deteriorating, behaviors and learning during the day. So, when in doubt, EEG. But in terms of, speaking to the epilepsy group, do the genetic testing, even if they told you they didn't find anything the first time. If you haven't done whole exome sequencing, if you can do something beyond maybe the initial array that they've done, it's very possible you could find something. And they're making new discoveries all the time. And the more and more of these rare genetic, syndromes come out, I think we're going to see a lot more people with them, which can lead to precision medicine and better treatments and just furthering research to be able to address families with that specific genetic mutation.
Yes, agreed. Thank you for that mention. Dr. Pina Garza, what about you? Final thoughts?
Well, just to think about epilepsy as a big spectrum, and if you're lucky enough that you get your correct diagnosis and treatment and you're happy, that's our job to do like a perfect marriage between that and a treatment so that you're free of symptoms with good quality of life. When you don't get that, don't give up. Ask for more questions, search more, try to find the specific diagnosis. It doesn't mean that you will always get it, but a lot of times we don't search for that enough to find it. And then try to find the specific treatments. And even if you're not able to get seizure freedom, always try to look at the possibility of offering that person the best quality of life.
Great advice. And Des, last words from you.
Okay, so what I really wanted to share was don't be afraid to ask for help. As a young person who moved very far away from home, it can get intimidating, but it's important to remember that, especially now, we're living in an era where people are becoming more socially aware of disabilities in the population. And as a result, there's been a movement towards more equity. So it is a slow process, but it's changing for the better. So don't be afraid to ask for help, because it's protecting you, those around you. It doesn't make you inferior. Like, accommodations, they're your right. They're not a privilege. It's to help us function at the same level as a quote unquote normal person. So just don't be afraid to reach out and get help if you need it.
Very wise words. Really appreciate that. Well, I want to just thank our incredibly knowledgeable and gracious panel, Dr. Pina Garza, Desiree, and Angie. Thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your wisdom and your journeys. I want to thank our sponsors, Neurocrine Biosciences and UCB. And we hope that all of you, if you are not seizure first aid trained, you will visit the epilepsy website and look for seizure first aid training opportunities, and that you will also join us this spring in Nashville, close to Dr. Pina Garza. Hopefully we'll get a chance to see him there in person, where we're going to be celebrating epilepsy, engaging, learning, and connecting. Thanks again for joining us. It was our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.